Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're setting sail into some pretty turbulent waters, exploring a topic that's not just making headlines, but genuinely shaping the global financial landscape. We're talking about the escalating concerns around U.S. fiscal health. Now, if you've been tracking economic news for a while, you know that worries about government deficits and debt aren't exactly new. We've heard alarms before, often about impending doom that, well, didn't quite show up as predicted, so it's easy to feel a bit of déjà vu,
It
right?
really is.
But here's the crucial point, and it's what makes this particular moment so compelling. There's a strong, persistent, and increasingly unified sentiment from some of the sharpest minds in finance, economics, and history that this time it truly is different.
That's the phrase you hear again and again.
Exactly. So, what's our mission in this deep dive for you, our listener? It's to cut through all the noise, to move beyond the headlines and the knee-jerk reactions, and to really dig into a rich stack of sources. We've pulled together a fascinating collection of articles, expert analyses, detailed research. Our goal is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the insights that truly matter, and to provide you with a comprehensive yet easily digestible understanding of the U.S. fiscal trajectory and its sweeping global implications.
Yeah, to really unpack it.
We're directly tackling that core question today. Is this time genuinely different for the U.S. fiscal situation, or are we just hearing another round of the same old warnings? And perhaps even more importantly, what does that mean for you? Whether you're an investor trying to navigate volatile markets, a business leader making strategic decisions, or simply someone who wants to feel truly well-informed about the complex world we live in, this discussion is designed to give you clarity.
Hopefully, yes.
And to help us navigate this intricate landscape, we're drawing on the wisdom of some truly exceptional voices. We'll be hearing directly from veteran investors who've seen multiple cycles, economists whose research shapes global policy, and leading historians who can put today's challenges into centuries of context.
A really great lineup.
Each of them offers a unique, sometimes provocative lens on this pressing issue. We'll start by focusing squarely on the United States, carefully dissecting the arguments that suggest a crisis is indeed looming and what that might look like. But we won't stop there. We'll then broaden our perspective, shifting our gaze to other global players, examining how Europe, Asia, and even emerging markets fit into this intricate financial tapestry. Get ready for some surprising facts and insights that might just reshape your understanding of what lies ahead.
It's true, the concern around U.S. fiscal health has seen a remarkable surge recently, reaching a new crescendo that's hard to ignore. A significant portion of this heightened anxiety can be directly linked to the Trump administration's, well, aptly named One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This legislative package, which has garnered considerable attention, is not just a minor budgetary adjustment. As estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, an independent, nonpartisan agency providing economic analysis to Congress, this bill is projected to increase the deficit by a staggering $2.4 trillion over the next decade.
Hold on, $2.4 trillion, that's an enormous figure. Can you put that into a broader context for us? What does that mean in relation to where the U.S. is fiscally right now?
Absolutely. To truly grasp the gravity of that $2.4 trillion projection, we need to understand the current fiscal backdrop. This increase is set to occur at a time when the U.S. deficit and its overall public debt, when measured as a share of its gross domestic product, or GDP, which is, the total value of goods and services produced in a country, are already at their highest levels outside of major crisis periods.
Okay, highest outside of crises.
Exactly. Historically, we have only seen these kinds of numbers, meaning a debt-to-GDP ratio exceeding 100% during times of immense national strain, like the height of World War II, or during the most severe economic collapses such as the Great Depression or the global financial crisis of 2008-09.
Right, wartime are huge crashes.
So, to be projecting such a substantial deficit increase outside of an immediate acute crisis period truly highlights the unique fiscal path the U.S. is on. It's quite unprecedented in peacetime, outside of those major events.
And what have the immediate, tangible implications of this been in the financial markets? Has it already caused a ripple effect?
It absolutely has. The implications of this trajectory are already making significant waves in the global financial world. One of the most prominent signals was Moody's, one of the big three major global credit rating agencies, taking the momentous step of stripping the U.S. of its last AAA rating.
Wow, losing the last AAA.
Yeah. A AAA rating signifies the highest credit quality, meaning the issuing government is considered extremely likely to meet its financial obligations. Losing that effectively signals a decline in the perceived creditworthiness of the United States, suggesting that even though it remains a highly creditworthy nation, the bull it's on introduces a greater degree of risk than before.
Okay.
This downgrade, combined with the sheer unprecedented volume of new debt the U.S. Treasury needs to issue to finance its operations — we're talking about auctions for trillions of dollars in bonds — has fueled a sharp sell-off in U.S. bonds.
And a sell-off means prices drop, yields go up.
Exactly. What a sell-off means is that the price of these bonds has dropped, and consequently, their yields, which is the return investors get for lending money to the government, have risen sharply. This makes it more expensive for the government to borrow. It's reached a point where eyes are closely trained on every single bond auction, anticipating market reactions. So despite those past alarms that never quite led to a full-blown crisis, there's a palpable and, frankly, unprecedented sense of urgency and concern now from market participants and prominent figures. It's no longer just a theoretical risk. The market is actively responding. This is what we're going to explore. Why do prominent figures who have long sounded warnings now believe a genuine crisis isn't just possible, but truly looms?
Okay, let's unpack this. The core of the matter, the central question we're grappling with today, is whether this time is different for the U.S. fiscal situation. And what's particularly striking is that three of the most insightful and often prescient economy watchers — Ray Dalio, the legendary investor; Kenneth Rogoff, the highly respected Harvard professor and former IMF chief economist; and Sir Niall Ferguson, the renowned historian — all strongly believe that, yes, this time is indeed different, and that a significant crisis lies ahead.
Quite a consensus there from different fields, too.
It is. And what's fascinating is that each of them brings a distinct, yet ultimately convergent set of arguments to the table. Let's dive deep into each of their perspectives, starting with Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's largest hedge funds.
Indeed, Ray Dalio frames his deep-seated concerns within his overarching theory of what he calls the big debt cycle.
The big debt cycle, right?
He posits that this cycle, which he has studied extensively through centuries of historical financial data, is fundamentally not well understood by most people. And there's a very specific reason for that. It's a phenomenon that occurs only about once in a lifetime.
Okay, so it's rare.
Very rare. It's not an annual event or even a decade-long one. It's a multi-decade, sometimes multi-century macroeconomic and monetary phenomenon that plays out across economies, culminating in significant, sometimes revolutionary monetary and economic shifts. Dalio isn't just speaking in abstract terms, though. He identifies three measurable, observable conditions that, when seen increasing, indicate a steady movement toward an impending crisis. These are the telltale signs, the diagnostic markers, if you will.
So he's given us the diagnosis and the rarity of the condition. But what are these specific symptoms we should be watching out for, these measurable conditions that indicate movement toward an impending crisis? And how do they really hit home for ordinary people or businesses?
Excellent question. The first condition Dalio points to is the amount of government debt service relative to government revenue. To break that down, debt service refers to the mandatory payments a government must make on its outstanding debt, primarily the interest payments and, less frequently, principal repayments.
Okay, the interest bill, basically.
Yeah, largely the interest bill. And government revenue, of course, is what the government collects through taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, sales taxes, and other sources. As this ratio increases, it means a larger and larger portion of the government's incoming money is being eaten up simply by paying off its existing debts.
It's like a household spending more and more on just credit card interest.
Precisely. Think of it like a household budget.
Right.
If your mortgage payment or credit card interest starts consuming an ever larger share of your monthly income, you have less and less available for everything else. At a national level, when debt service reaches unsustainable points, it leads to a critical problem Dalio calls crowding out.
Crowding out.
This means debt service begins to unacceptably crowd out other essential government spending, things like education, infrastructure, healthcare, defense, or social safety nets. It forces agonizing choices and can severely undermine public services or crucial long-term investments that drive future growth. It's a silent drain, but a very powerful one.
Got it. That's the first symptom. What's the second?
The second condition Dalio points to is the amount of debt the government needs to sell relative to the amount of demand for that government debt. Governments constantly issue new bonds to finance their daily operations, fund new programs, or rollover, meaning refinance, existing debt that's maturing.
Okay.
Imagine the U.S. Treasury holding regular auctions for its bonds. If the supply of new debt being sold far outstrips the demand from investors, be it individuals, pension funds, foreign governments, or banks who are willing to buy it, then something fundamental has to give.
Supply and demand, essentially.
Exactly. The consequence is that interest rates, which are effectively the cost of borrowing for the government, have to rise sharply in order to attract enough buyers. This surge in interest rates, this sudden increase in the cost of money for the government, can in turn send financial markets spiraling downward.
Why is that? Why does it hit the broader markets?
Because higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive, not just for the government, but for everyone. Businesses find it costlier to invest in new factories or equipment, and consumers face higher rates on mortgages and car loans. This slows investment, dampens consumption, and can significantly depress the overall economy, potentially triggering a recession. It's a direct market feedback loop.
Okay, makes sense. And the third condition?
And finally, the third condition is the amount of money central banks need to print to purchase government debt to make up for this demand shortfall. This is where it gets particularly interesting and often controversial.
Right, the Fed stepping in.
When interest rates rise too much due to that supply-demand imbalance, and the market isn't absorbing enough government debt, central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, or the European Central Bank might step in as the buyer of last resort. They do this by literally creating new money electronically and using it to buy government bonds from the market. While this can temporarily keep interest rates down and ensure the government can finance itself, Dalio argues it comes at a severe long-term cost. It reduces the value of money.
Inflation, basically.
It can certainly lead to inflation, yes. It effectively acts as a stealth tax on everyone holding that currency, subtly eroding their purchasing power and leading to inflation over time. Ultimately, if taken to extremes, it devalues the currency itself on the global stage. It's a powerful but ultimately destructive tool if overused.
So those three things, debt service versus revenue, supply versus demand for bonds, and central bank printing.
Correct. Dalio uses a very powerful and vivid analogy to describe what happens when these three measurable conditions, these symptoms, increase to an unsustainable point. He calls it a debt-induced economic heart attack.
Wow.
Just as a heart attack occurs when the flow of blood, which is absolutely essential for life, is constricted, a debt crisis happens when the constriction of debt-financed spending becomes unavoidable. This constriction can be due to debt service consuming too much revenue, interest rates soaring because of supply-demand imbalance in the bond market, or central bank money printing leading to currency devaluation and a loss of confidence. In all these scenarios, the returns on bonds become terrible, effectively punishing savers and investors, and the entire financial system undergoes a painful, often wrenching adjustment until bonds become so cheap that they attract demand again, or the debt is forcibly restructured, perhaps even defaulted on. Dalio emphasizes that these signs of deterioration are not hidden. They are measurable and observable, allowing one to clearly see the movement toward an impending crisis long before it fully manifests if one is paying attention.
That debt-induced economic heart attack analogy is incredibly powerful. It really drives home the idea that this isn't just about abstract numbers on a balance sheet, but fundamental economic health. What's Dalio's perspective on why we're seeing this now and why so many people seem complacent despite these warnings?
Dalio stresses that this current moment, despite its unique contemporary flavors and specific policy decisions, has hundreds of historical analogs stretching back as far as recorded economic history.
It's happened before, basically. Many times.
Many, many times. He points out that virtually all countries and empires have gone through the same process, sometimes repeatedly, and it has consistently led to breakdowns of all monetary orders. He cites the British pound in the 20th century, and even before that, the Dutch guilder in the 18th century, as prime examples of former global reserve currencies that ultimately succumbed to these very dynamics.
So even reserve currencies aren't immune?
Not at all. Their reign as the world's dominant currency ended precisely because their underlying fiscal and monetary policies became unsustainable. He notes that the process isn't widely understood or appreciated precisely because it happens so infrequently, only about once in a lifetime, when these established monetary orders break down. This rarity, combined with what he calls premature warnings of crises that didn't immediately materialize because, remember, these cycles play out over decades, has led to a dangerous level of public and policy complacency.
Like the boy who cried wolf.
Exactly like the boy who cried wolf. He likens it to a patient with severe arterial plaque who, despite clear diagnostic signs like high cholesterol and blood pressure, ignores their doctor's urgent warnings because nothing has happened yet. This patient's continued consumption of unhealthy food and lack of exercise, despite the clear and escalating diagnostic signs, mirrors how some policymakers and markets appear to view the U.S. fiscal situation today. It's a gamble that ignores historical precedent.
So what does he see as the trigger, the catalyst?
Regarding the immediate catalyst for a potential U.S. debt crisis, Dalio believes it will be a convergence of the three influences. He just outlined the increasing burden of debt service consuming too much revenue, the imbalance between the supply of government debt and the demand for it, and the resulting need for central bank money printing.
The three symptoms coming together.
Precisely. The precise timing of this convergence, he admits, can be hastened or postponed by policy. For instance, he estimates that if the budget deficit were reduced from its currently projected 7% of GDP down to about 3% of GDP, that singular significant policy action would go a long way toward reducing the risks.
Okay, so policy changes could help.
They could. He also levels a strong critique at those who dismiss the risks to the U.S. simply because of the dollar's current global reserve currency status. He argues that they are missing an understanding of the mechanics and lessons of history. He firmly states that for a currency and its associated debt to maintain their global standing, they must be effective stores of wealth. If they aren't, if their value is consistently eroded by inflation or devaluation, they will inevitably be devalued and ultimately abandoned by global investors, just as all prior reserve currencies eventually lost their status. The U.S. dollar, he warns, is not immune to these powerful, immutable historical forces.
That's a really stark warning, especially about the dollar's vulnerability. Now, a common counterargument to the idea of a looming U.S. debt crisis often points to Japan, which has an even higher debt-to-GDP ratio but hasn't had a full-blown crisis. What does Dalio say to that? Does he take comfort from the Japanese experience?
On the contrary, Dalio makes a crucial point, and it's one he feels is often misunderstood. He refuses to take comfort from Japan's long history of high debt levels without an outright sudden crisis. In fact, he argues that Japan doesn't contradict his theory. It exemplifies his theory in practice, showcasing a slow-motion crisis.
A slow-motion crisis? How so?
He details how the Japanese government's significant indebtedness has, over time, made Japanese bonds and debt terrible investments for those holding them. To make up for a consistent shortage of market demand for Japanese debt at low enough interest rates, because who wants to buy a bond that yields next to nothing in an environment of increasing supply? The Bank of Japan is engaged in massive, unprecedented money printing to buy government debt. This is precisely Dalio's third condition playing out.
The central bank buying up the debt.
Exactly. And the consequences of this are stark and profoundly impactful on the Japanese people. Japanese bondholders, those who lent money to their government, have lost a staggering 45% of their value relative to holders of U.S. dollar debt since 2013, when measured in common currency terms.
45% loss relative to U.S. debt holders.
Wow. And the picture is even more significant relative to gold. They've lost 60% of their value compared to gold holders over the same period. This means that if you were a Japanese saver holding Japanese government bonds, your wealth has been significantly eroded compared to someone holding U.S. assets or gold.
Okay, so bondholders lost out. What about regular people?
But even more striking, and certainly more impactful on a human level, Dalio notes that the typical wages of a Japanese worker have fallen by an astonishing 58% since 2013, in common currency terms, relative to the wages of an American worker.
58% lower wages relative to the U.S.
Since 2013, yes. This, he argues, is the crisis in slow motion, a gradual but devastating devaluation of wealth and living standards for an entire nation. It's a powerful demonstration of the real-world costs of an unsustainable debt trajectory, even without a sudden dramatic default or an immediate market collapse. It's death by 1,000 cuts, not a single sharp blow.
That's a truly chilling example, a silent erosion of wealth and living standards. So if that's the diagnosis, what are Dalio's proposed solutions for the U.S., and how should investors position themselves in this environment?
So what can be done? Dalio proposes clear, actionable solutions for the U.S. to address its indebtedness and prevent this slow-motion crisis from accelerating or becoming acute. The government, he suggests, can and should reduce the budget deficit to 3% of GDP. This is a significant cut from the projected 7% of GDP.
Having the projected deficit, basically.
Roughly, yes. Crucially, he emphasizes that this reduction must be achieved in a way that balances spending cuts and tax revenue increases, carefully calibrated, so as not to inflict fiscal trauma on any part of the economy.
Yeah.
It can't be a sudden austerity shock. He estimates that successfully achieving this 3% deficit would then lead interest rates to decline significantly, potentially to around 1.5%.
Lower rates would help the debt service problem.
Immensely. Such lower rates would not only directly reduce the government's debt service payments by approximately 2% of GDP per year, providing immediate budget relief, but also stimulate a rise in asset prices and overall economic activity by making borrowing cheaper for businesses and consumers. This increased economic activity, in turn, would generate much more government revenue, potentially creating a virtuous cycle where the economy supports fiscal health rather than being constrained by it.
Okay, so that's the policy fix. What about for investors listening right now?
For investors looking to navigate this complex and potentially volatile environment, Dalio offers specific, actionable recommendations. Given his expectation that most major developed countries, including the UK, the EU, China, Japan, and critically, the US are facing similar underlying debt and deficit problems, which will likely lead to a debt and currency devaluation process, he advises a multi-pronged approach to protecting wealth. First, he recommends diversifying wealth, not just across different asset classes like stocks and bonds, but also, and perhaps more importantly, across countries that exhibit strong income statements and balance sheets.
Fiscally strong countries.
Yes, countries that are not grappling with significant internal political conflicts or external geopolitical tensions, which could undermine their fiscal stability. Second, and this is a significant shift from traditional investment wisdom, he advises investors to underweight debt assets like bonds, reflecting his view that these will be poor investments in an environment where governments are struggling to service their debt and currencies are being devalued through money printing.
So less reliance on government bonds.
That's his view. And third, and perhaps most tellingly, he suggests overweighting non-government-produced fiat monies, such as gold and, to a lesser extent, Bitcoin. These, he argues, can serve as alternative stores of wealth, insulated from the sovereign debt and currency devaluation process that he believes is already underway or looming in many major economies. It's a call for a fundamental reassessment of what constitutes a safe haven.
Wow, Dalio's perspective on the big debt cycle and his stark examples, especially Japan's quiet decline in purchasing power and the dramatic fall in wages relative to the U.S., certainly paint a worrying picture. It really makes you rethink what a crisis truly looks like. Here's where it gets really interesting, because Kenneth Rogoff, the highly influential professor at Harvard and former IMF chief economist, shares a similar urgency about the U.S. fiscal situation, but he approaches it from a slightly different, though equally critical, angle. He focuses intently on the dramatic shifts we're seeing in global interest rates.
That's absolutely right. Kenneth Rogoff's central argument for why this time is different hinges significantly on what he views as a fundamental and persistent rise in global long-term real interest rates.
Real rates, meaning adjusted for inflation.
Exactly. He firmly believes that this upward movement in rates is a crucial normalization, not an aberration. He explains that for a prolonged period following the global financial crisis, roughly from 2008 to 2021, we experienced a period of declining and persistently low interest rates globally.
Yeah, the post-GFC low-rate world.
Rogoff contends that many policymakers, economists, and market participants wrongly assumed that these abnormally low rates would simply remain forever. And under that flawed assumption, the idea that high debt levels weren't a significant concern gained considerable traction, almost becoming conventional wisdom. The logic was, if borrowing is cheap, why worry about how much you borrow?
Right.
But, as he notes, real interest rates, which are nominal rates minus inflation, reflecting the true cost of borrowing, tend to mean revert, even if slowly, over long cycles. Their current upward trajectory, he argues, is the market correcting itself, returning to a more historically typical level. He even recounts how a decade ago, when advising U.S. Treasury officials on debt management, his warnings about this coming normalization were often met with skepticism, sometimes even dismissed as overly pessimistic. Now, with rates indeed having risen substantially, fiscal concerns have grown, but Rogoff warns not nearly enough, because many still cling to an overly optimistic notion that rates will very likely return to pre-pandemic levels. He sees this as wishful thinking, a dangerous self-delusion.
So if this rise in real interest rates is a normalization, not just a temporary blip, what are the persistent forces Rogoff identifies as driving these rates up? And why does he believe they're here to stay, creating a more challenging environment for highly indebted countries like the U.S.?
Rogoff is very clear and concise about the powerful, persistent forces he identifies as driving up these rates, explaining why they are fundamentally here to stay. First, we have already high global debt levels across many economies, not just the U.S. The world as a whole has accumulated an unprecedented amount of debt.
Okay, high global debt.
Second, there are increased fiscal demands stemming from global fragmentation. as countries reevaluate their supply chains, seeking to bring production closer to home for security and resilience, and as geopolitical tensions rise, they prioritize domestic capabilities, which requires significant public investment.
Reshoring, friendshoring, that kind of thing.
Precisely. Third, pervasive geopolitical uncertainty, from ongoing conflicts to heightened tensions, necessitates greater public spending on defense and security. Fourth, and this is a fascinating modern twist, there's a rapidly rising energy demand, specifically to accommodate the immense growth in AI technology.
AI's energy thirst, right?
Yeah, AI data centers and processing power are incredibly energy intensive, and that demand places upward pressure on energy prices and thus, potentially, on inflation and interest rates. And fifth, significant remilitarization efforts are underway worldwide as nations respond to a more fractured and dangerous geopolitical landscape. This also adds substantial fiscal burdens.
So debt, fragmentation, geopolitics, AI energy needs, and defense spending, that's a lot pushing rates up.
It is. And in the U.S. specifically, he points out that former President Trump's stated push to reduce the trade deficit, if successful, could inadvertently lower the capital inflows that have historically put downward pressure on U.S. interest rates. When foreign investors buy fewer U.S. assets because of a shrinking trade deficit, there's less external demand for U.S. bonds, which can push yields higher. The combination of these powerful global forces, Rogoff argues, poses a serious and sustained challenge for countries, particularly the U.S., that have become accustomed to continuously piling on debt in a multi-decade era of historically cheap money. That era, he asserts, is fundamentally over.
And that leads to his point about debt not being a free lunch.
Exactly. Rogoff takes a very strong and unambiguous stance against what he critically calls the notion that debt is a free lunch, labeling it absurd. This idea, which gained currency during the low-rate environment, suggested that governments could borrow indefinitely without serious consequences if interest rates remained below economic growth rates. He emphasizes that while unsustainable fiscal dynamics can indeed persist for a while, perhaps even longer than many expect, they absolutely cannot persist forever. Eventually, the bill comes due. He connects the current high rates directly to the record-high U.S. public debt, which has skyrocketed from roughly 30% of GDP in 1980 to an astonishing and unprecedented over 120% of GDP today.
30% to over 120%, that's a huge jump.
It's an exponential rise over 4 decades. Given this historical context, he finds it mind-blowing that the Trump administration appears set to further increase an already unusually large deficit, especially given that Trump's own campaign criticized the inflationary consequences of the Biden-era deficits. Rogoff underscores this warning with a powerful quote attributed to Rudy Dornbush, following Herb Stein. "Financial crises take longer to happen than you think they should, but when they do, they unfold faster than you think they could."
Wow. Say that again?
Financial crises take longer to happen than you think they should, but when they do, they unfold faster than you think they could.
That's chilling. It means complacency is dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. It means that public and market complacency can persist for years, allowing underlying problems to fester and grow, often leading to a false sense of security. But once the breaking point is reached, the unraveling can be shockingly swift and severe, often catching everyone off guard and making policy responses far more difficult and painful. It's the sudden dramatic acceleration after a long period of seemingly slow, manageable deterioration.
That quote about crises unfolding faster than you think they could is truly sobering. So if Rogoff believes a crisis is looming, how does he envision it might look for the U.S.? And what's his updated timeline for it?
When asked about the specific timeline for such a crisis, Rogoff has actually adjusted his previous prediction, indicating a heightened sense of urgency. In his recent book, Our Dollar, Your Problem, written before former President Trump's re-election, he projected that a crisis was more likely than not within 5 to 7 years.
Okay, 5 to 7 years pre-election.
Now, with the current administration's stated policy agenda, which he sees as further exacerbating the fiscal challenges, he believes that timing could be shortened to just 4 or 5 years.
4 or 5 years. That's much sooner.
Much sooner. While acknowledging the possibility that stronger economic growth, potentially driven by a significant boost from AI technology, could help avert a debt-related crisis by increasing tax revenues, he remains highly skeptical that it will happen quickly or smoothly enough to make a difference to the immediate and pressing fiscal challenges. He also dismisses what he calls the silly arithmetic of economists who focus solely on growth interest rate differentials to predict crises, noting that historically, almost every country that has defaulted on its debt has done so long before such debt calculus would have technically suggested a problem. Human and political factors, he implies, often trigger crises well before the pure numbers might suggest.
Okay, so not an outright default maybe, but what kind of crisis?
So what might a U.S. fiscal crisis actually look like, according to Rogoff? He doesn't foresee an outright U.S. debt default in the traditional sense, like what happened in the 1930s, when FDR effectively devalued the dollar by raising the price of gold, causing losses for foreign creditors. Instead, he believes America's debt problems will likely unfold in one of two principal ways, both potentially painful. The first, and he deems it the most likely scenario, is a sharp rise in inflation that occurs in conjunction with an economic shock.
Inflation plus some kind of shock.
Right. While the exact nature of this shock is hard to predict, it could be geopolitical, a major supply disruption, or another financial tremor. Rogoff warns it would likely be more painful than the COVID inflation shock that we experienced.
More painful than the recent inflation spike.
That's what he suggests. That earlier inflation surge, while significant, required only relatively minor adjustments in bond markets, as the Federal Reserve quickly raised interest rates. If inflation were to spike again due to overwhelming debt concerns and a loss of market confidence, he anticipates a much bigger adjustment that investors aren't anticipating or prepared for, implying a more significant repricing of bonds, stocks, and other assets,
Yeah.
potentially leading to substantial losses for investors and a more widespread economic contraction.
Okay, so that's one possibility. What's the other?
Second possibility he outlines is financial repression.
Financial repression. What exactly is that?
This is a more subtle, insidious way governments can deal with overwhelming debt, and it involves intentionally keeping interest rates artificially low through various policy mechanisms. These could include imposing interest rate caps, essentially dictating a maximum rate on government bonds, mandating high reserve requirements for banks, which effectively forces them to hold government bonds rather than lend to the private sector, and implementing restrictions on capital flows, making it harder for money to leave the country.
So basically forcing money into government bonds at low rates.
That's the essence of it. While financial repression can indeed make it easier for the government to finance its burgeoning debt by effectively forcing domestic entities to lend to it cheaply, Rogoff stresses that it comes at a significant cost to overall economic growth and individual prosperity. He explains it as essentially a tax on savers, as their returns are artificially suppressed, meaning their money earns very little, sometimes even losing value after inflation.
Right.
And it reduces the flow of capital to the private sector, stifling private investment, innovation, and job creation. Japan offers a clear and long-standing example of this, using yield curve control for decades to keep its rates low, which, while staving off a dramatic crisis, has arguably mired the country in a two-decade growth crisis characterized by stagnation and deflation.
So like Dalio's slow motion crisis idea.
Very similar concept, yes. Europe also resorted to a form of financial repression post-global financial crisis, which Rogoff believes contributed to that region's ongoing growth struggles. It's a slow bleed rather than a sudden rupture.
That's a fascinating and chilling look at how a crisis can manifest. Now, you mentioned earlier that the dollar's dominance has often been cited as a unique cushion for U.S. fiscal policies. How does Rogoff see the dollar's role changing in this new environment? Is that cushion starting to deflate?
Rogoff views the dollar's dominance, which has indeed often been cited as a unique cushion, allowing the U.S. to run larger deficits than other nations without immediate penalty, as now exhausted.
Exhausted. That's a strong word.
It is. He argues that foreign demand for U.S. debt, while vast, is not limitless, and the sheer volume of debt the U.S. has been issuing has likely brought it close to the point of saturation for international investors. There's only so much capacity and willingness from central banks and global funds to absorb more U.S. treasuries. He points out that the dollar's dominance is far from guaranteed to last forever, citing historical precedent. After the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates collapsed in the 1970s, Europe largely abandoned the dollar for internal trade and finance, leading to a significant loss of its global market share over time. He warns it would be a mistake to assume this cannot happen again.
So history shows it can erode. Is it happening now?
Indeed, he notes that the dollar bloc has already begun to splinter, in subtle but significant ways, with China aggressively moving away from the dollar in its international dealings in recent years. Growing distrust of the U.S.'s financial policies and geopolitical actions has prompted countries in Africa and Latin America to seek dollar alternatives like the renminbi for some trade. Furthermore, the U.S. is increasing and often unilateral use of economic and financial sanctions while achieving policy goals, is actively incentivizing many countries to try to break free from the dollar-centric monetary order by seeking alternative payment systems and reserve assets.
So sanctions are actually pushing countries away from the dollar.
That's his argument. These shifts, he explains, are not just about central bank reserve holdings or trade denomination. They reflect a deeper, more fundamental reorientation of underlying global financial flows that have long sustained the dollar's unparalleled role.
Does he see another currency taking over soon?
Rogoff doesn't necessarily expect the dollar to be outright replaced by a single contender in the short term, but he envisions its dominance further diminishing. Over the next decade or two, he anticipates a more tripolar currency landscape, with the dollar still at the top, but with the renminbi and the euro having further encroached on its share in global trade, finance, and reserve holdings.
Tripolar, dollar, euro, renminbi.
That's the idea. He terms this the global colonization of the dollar declines. He also points out that cryptocurrencies will continue to chip away at the dollar's role, particularly in the vast underground economy, which he estimates accounts for around 20% of global GDP, further eroding the exorbitant privilege the dollar has long enjoyed, especially in illicit transactions or areas where traditional banking is less accessible.
Interesting point about crypto.
Beyond these external pressures, internal factors will also likely weigh on the dollar's appeal. He reiterates the U.S.'s mounting debt issues, which he believes will ultimately lead to a significant devaluation of the dollar in real terms. And perhaps most controversially, he highlights the risk of eroding Fed independence.
Eroding Fed independence. How so?
While many believe the operational independence of the Federal Reserve is sacrosanct and critical for monetary stability, he warns it is not guaranteed and could disappear at the whim of Congress, particularly in times of severe fiscal stress or political polarization. If the Fed were perceived as being forced to print money to finance government debt, it would severely lessen the appeal of dollar holdings for foreign investors, exacerbating the U.S. debt problem by shrinking the pool of foreigners willing to hold U.S. debt.
That would be a major blow to confidence.
Absolutely. Rogoff's concerns extend well beyond the U.S. borders. He highlights Europe's increasingly worrying fiscal outlook due to the surge in debt accumulated from the pandemic response and the energy crisis triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war.
Europe has its own debt issues, too.
Definitely. He notes that Europe's funding needs will only continue to grow significantly in the coming years, driven by ambitious green energy goals, the critical push for greater energy independence from unreliable sources, and the absolute necessity to significantly increase military spending, all of which require substantial public investment. While fiscally conservative countries like Germany might have the necessary space to absorb a rapid rise in debt to GDP, which is already underway, much of the rest of Europe is already heavily indebted, with countries like Italy, France, and Spain already carrying substantial pre-existing burdens.
Right. The periphery and France have high debt.
Decades of underinvestment, particularly in defense, mean Europe is now playing catch-up in a very dangerous world, with military spending likely needing to rise from the current 2% of GDP target to as much as 4 or 5% of GDP in many nations. Compounding these challenges, Europe faces both cyclical economic difficulties like recent slowdowns and structural problems, such as aging populations and rigid labor markets that hinder its ability to generate robust economic growth and grow out of its fiscal burdens.
So Europe's facing a tough combination of pressures. What about emerging markets?
Emerging markets, which have historically been a consistent source of fiscal concerns in debt crises, will also find themselves under considerable pressure amid the broader, sustained rise in global yields. Rogoff notes that many small and medium-sized emerging markets have already experienced outright defaults or severe debt distress in recent years, and the risk of defaults in much larger ones has grown significantly. He concludes that the persistently higher real interest rates he expects, driven by the global forces we discussed, will likely prove challenging for both developed and emerging market economies alike, underscoring that this is truly a global problem, not confined to one region or country.
And politically, does he see any willingness to tackle this?
When it comes to politicians taking fiscal issues seriously, particularly in the U.S., Rogoff is quite pessimistic. He believes people, both voters and politicians, need to recognize that higher interest rates are fundamentally here to stay, and that a return to the low-rate era of the past decade is nothing more than wishful thinking.
People are in denial, basically.
That's his view. He argues that the macro environment has fundamentally shifted, but fiscal policy globally, and especially in the U.S., has not adjusted to this new reality. While companies in some segments of the financial market are starting to adapt to higher rates, voters remain in denial, which critically prevents politicians from taking serious and often unpopular steps needed to address deficits. He states bluntly that neither party can remain in power by trying to bring down deficits, because voters don't demand it, and few politicians are willing to draw a line in the sand on spending or taxes.
So no political reward for fiscal responsibility.
Sadly, that seems to be the case often. Unfortunately, he concludes that this denial will likely persist until a crisis of some type emerges, but waiting for such a crisis would be a costly mistake for any nation.
That's a sobering assessment from Rogoff, particularly his points on the erosion of the dollar's dominance and the profound political inertia. It paints a picture of a system waiting for a shake, and it's precisely these long-term historical forces that Sir Niall Ferguson, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Belfer Center, brings into even sharper focus. As a leading historian, his insights often frame current events within centuries of historical patterns, and he has a particularly pointed law that he believes the U.S. is now violating.
Sir Niall Ferguson brings a unique and often provocative historical lens to the perennial debate around how much government debt is simply too much. He argues that the historical record provides two crucial, often overlooked insights. First, there isn't a rigid, absolute, universally applicable maximum threshold for public debt as a percentage of GDP. Great powers throughout history, he points out, have demonstrated an extraordinary, almost counterintuitive ability to issue vast amounts of debt and manage what appear to be staggering debt stocks.
So there's no magic number for debt to GDP.
Not really, no. A classic example is Great Britain in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, where major wars pushed its debt-to-GDP ratio above 200% for significant periods. This was well above the 90–100% threshold that some modern economists might cite as problematic for developed economies.
Right, Britain handled huge debt after wars.
And perhaps even more counterintuitively, Japan's gross debt-to-GDP ratio today stands at an even higher, truly eye-watering 250%, yet it has long grappled with deflation, not runaway inflation or a sudden crisis. So, raw debt numbers alone, while alarming, don't tell the whole story or predict the entire outcome.
Okay, so debt to GDP isn't the best measure. What is then?
Ferguson's second, and in his view, far more concerning insight, is that there are better, more historically robust ways to measure a country's true debt sustainability and its implications for great power status. His personal favorite is what he calls Ferguson's Law, a simple yet profoundly insightful heuristic, comparing a nation's interest expenses, that's the money it spends, just to service its debt, to its defense spending.
Interest payments versus defense spending.
Exactly. He states very clearly and very starkly that the former exceeding the latter spells trouble. This isn't a theoretical model. It's an empirical observation from centuries of history. History, he notes, is ripe with examples of superpowers that have spent more on debt service than defense, and subsequently were no longer super or powerful.
And the U.S.?
And this, he warns, is exactly the position the U.S. is in today. Despite the U.S. gross debt-to-GDP ratio being at its post-World War II peak of roughly 120%, America is now, for the first time in nearly a century, spending more on interest payments than on defense. This, for Ferguson, is a critical, alarming turning point that leaves him very concerned about the U.S. fiscal situation because it signals a deep structural imbalance that has historically preceded decline.
That's a powerful and visceral metric. Interest payments exceeding defense spending. It almost feels like a country losing its capacity to protect itself because it's too busy paying its bills. You mentioned Ferguson has been warning about this for a while. What makes him so convinced that now is the moment this law is truly biting?
Ferguson acknowledges that concerns about America's finances are not new. He's been warning about an unsustainable fiscal path for 2 decades, sometimes feeling, as he puts it, like the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah, we heard that theme before.
The problem, of course, with crying wolf is that people eventually stop listening. But, he emphasizes, a key lesson of history is that a great power like the U.S., the world's top military power, issuer of the global reserve currency, and provider of what has long been considered risk-free debt, can light many matches in the dynamite room and get away with it for a time.
Get away with it for a while.
This is the nature of exorbitant privilege and global confidence. However, he cautions, eventually the sentiment shifts. That shift, he argues, has now arrived in quite dramatic fashion. Investors have indeed started actively reducing their U.S. Treasury holdings and moving away from the dollar.
We heard Trivedi mention that too.
Exactly. These movements have led to the very unusual combination of higher bond yields and a weaker dollar. Simultaneously, typically, if yields rise, the currency strengthens, but not here. This unusual combination has naturally raised alarms in financial markets. He powerfully invokes James Carville's famous 1993 quote that if he were to be reincarnated, he wouldn't come back as the Pope or the President, but as the bond market, because it terrifies everybody.
Ah, that's a great quote.
Ferguson asserts that the bond market is now threatening to do that today for really the first time since the Clinton administration, with the bond vigilantes back to remind politicians of fiscal discipline. These are investors who, by selling bonds and driving up yields, essentially punish governments for perceived fiscal profligacy, forcing them to rein in spending.
The bond vigilantes are back.
So he argues. He further explains the profound significance of the U.S. spending more on interest than defense for the first time since the era of isolationism nearly a century ago. Historically, throughout its reign as the global hegemon, particularly during the Cold War, the U.S. was able to dedicate an extraordinarily large share of its GDP to its military, with its defense budget averaging close to 7% of GDP from 1960 through the Cold War.
7% of GDP on defense. Huge.
This allowed it to accumulate significant stocks of the world's most sophisticated military hardware, maintaining a technological and numerical edge over any adversary. In stark contrast, today's defense spending hovers around a mere 3% of GDP, less than half of its Cold War average.
Only 3% now.
Moreover, during that same Cold War period, the massive debt the U.S. ran up in World War II actually shrank dramatically relative to GDP, not just through economic growth, but also through some inflation. This allowed the U.S. to effectively leave its immense WWII debt problem behind for most of the latter half of the 20th century.
So they grew out of the WWII debt while spending heavily on defense.
Correct. That, Ferguson argues, is no longer the case. The U.S. now faces real fiscal constraints on its ability to maintain and field the world's leading military, a truly precarious position given the global security landscape. This is particularly concerning at a time when China has undeniably become a serious military power, rapidly modernizing its forces and challenging U.S. influence across the Indo-Pacific.
Right, the China challenge.
Furthermore, the nature of warfare itself is shifting significantly. Warfare is moving away from the expensive traditional hardware like aircraft carriers and stealth bombers that dominated the 1990s toward next-gen, cheap, disposable hardware like advanced drones, AI-powered systems, and cyber warfare capabilities.
Cheaper, but needs investment to adapt.
Exactly. This shift means the U.S. will need to invest significant resources to keep up in this new military era, essentially undergoing a costly military transformation. Yet Ferguson notes the current U.S. fiscal trajectory suggests that the U.S. will spend more on interest payments than on defense for the next 2 decades.
For the next 2 decades.
That's the projection based on current trends. Furthermore, the Trump administration's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, with its projected increase in deficits, will likely worsen this already concerning trajectory, making it even harder for the U.S. to maintain its military edge. Ferguson's chilling conclusion is that any great power that pursues a reckless fiscal policy by allowing the cost of its debt to exceed the cost of its armed services is opening itself up to challenge and risks losing its great power status, fundamentally undermining its ability to project power and maintain global order.
So history shows this is a danger sign for great powers. What are some examples?
Ferguson, as a historian, has traced this precise pattern back through centuries of imperial and national decline. He details how public debt first became crucial to global power dominance during the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. Throughout the 1500s, Spain relied heavily on long and short-term debt to finance its vast military endeavors across Europe and the Americas.
Okay, Spain in the 1500s.
However, after 1600, the interest on this burgeoning debt began to exceed the empire's defense spending. Spain, relatively quickly, found itself facing multiple severe challenges to its empire, and effectively ceased to be a great power in Europe later that same century, its military strength constrained by its financial weakness.
Wow, it happened that fast after the crossover.
Relatively fast, yes. The same fate, he explains, befell the Dutch Republic and France in the 18th century, both losing their dominant positions due to unsustainable debt burdens relative to their military needs. This pattern repeated with the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary in the 19th century, vast empires that crumbled under the weight of their financial imbalances, unable to modernize or sustain their military might.
Dutch, French, Ottomans, Austrians. Quite a list.
And more recently, Great Britain in the late 20th century, which, though still a significant power, saw its global reach diminish as its debt outstripped its capacity to maintain its armed forces. The U.S., he warns, is simply the latest great power to find itself in this perilous fiscal jam, risking the same historical outcome. His stark lesson from the 20th century is that deterrence is vastly preferable to fighting a major war. He argues that if Britain had been able to deter Germany in 1914 and again in 1939 through sufficient military preparedness, it wouldn't have ended up exhausted and in decline in the late 20th century.
Deterrence requires strength, which requires fiscal room.
Precisely. He concludes with a powerful warning for today. If the U.S. fails to put itself in a fiscal position to deter China, it could very well meet the same fate, implying a potential loss of global leadership and security influence.
Those historical parallels are quite sobering, especially that final warning about deterring China. But is there any historical counterexample to Ferguson's law? Has any great power managed to defy this pattern and avoid decline despite violating the rule?
While Ferguson paints a grim picture, he does offer a rare, albeit reassuring, counterexample that provides a glimmer of hope. Great Britain in the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries.
Ah, okay. Britain again, but this time as a positive example.
In a way, yes. Britain, he notes, actually violated Ferguson's law several times during that period, meaning its interest payments exceeded its defense spending. Yet, in each instance, it managed to successfully reduce its debt service costs and, crucially, increase its defense budget again. This, he argues, partly explains the remarkable longevity and sustained power of the British Empire for so long.
How did they manage that?
For example, after World War I, Britain was indeed saddled with a mountain of debt, with interest costs exceeding military spending every single year from 1920 to 1936. This dire fiscal situation, Ferguson reveals, was the real rationale for the policy of appeasement toward rising powers like Nazi Germany. Britain simply couldn't afford to rearm or project strength.
So the debt constrained their foreign policy.
Absolutely. However, critically, through prudent fiscal management, they eventually regained control. This, Ferguson explains, made rearmament possible just in time for Great Britain to win the Battle of Britain and avoid defeat at the hands of Hitler in World War II. It was a close call, but their ability to put their fiscal house in order allowed them to respond to existential threats.
So it is possible to recover from violating the law.
It is possible, but it requires serious effort. Ferguson draws explicit and compelling parallels between Britain's historical experience and the U.S. today. He sees the U.S. as similarly overextended in its global commitments, grappling with a large debt burden it can't seem to grow out of.
Right.
Furthermore, he views the current period as an interwar period akin to Britain's, situated between the First Cold War with Russia and a looming Second Cold War with China. The crucial lesson from Britain's experience, he stresses, is that prudent fiscal management made rearmament possible.
Fiscal health enables security.
If U.S. leaders recognize this reality and act swiftly and decisively to address the debt problem and modernize the military effectively, America just might be able to replicate Britain's success in navigating a dangerous interwar period. However, Ferguson is deeply worried. While a bipartisan consensus does exist in the U.S. regarding the challenge posed by China, he notes that no consensus exists about how to lower the deficit and stabilize the debt.
The political will isn't there, as Rogoff also noted.
Exactly. In fact, he finds that the only consensus around this issue seems to be to not do anything about it, which he finds incredibly alarming and fuels his concern that America is sleepwalking towards decline.
And what about the dollar's privilege? Does Ferguson agree with Rogoff there?
Ferguson largely agrees with Kenneth Rogoff that the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which is its special status as the world's primary reserve currency and the preferred currency for international trade and finance, has eroded over time.
He questions if it was ever that much of a privilege.
Well, he questions its current power. He asks that if such status truly bestowed tremendous privilege, wouldn't the U.S. enjoy premium in the form of very low borrowing costs relative to less powerful countries without such privilege? But it doesn't, he points out, with the U.S. today facing higher borrowing costs than many advanced countries like Germany.
That's a good point. U.S. borrowing costs aren't uniquely low.
This, he argues, strongly suggests that the privilege has indeed significantly eroded, or at least its protective power has diminished. He attributes this erosion to several factors. The U.S. exploiting it to excess since severing the link between the dollar and gold in 1971, which removed a key anchor of trust. Its increasingly aggressive use of economic and financial sanctions, which incentivizes other countries to find alternatives, and the broader shift toward a more multipolar world where contenders like the euro and the renminbi are emerging as viable, albeit not yet fully equal, alternatives.
Similar reasons to Rogoff again.
Yes, strong alignment there. He specifically notes that China's strict capital controls are currently the only thing stopping the RMB from posing a proper challenge to the dollar by limiting its free convertibility. Therefore, he concludes, we simply shouldn't expect the dollar to save the U.S. from the consequences of its fiscal recklessness, as its unique status is no longer the bulletproof vest it once was.
What about other countries? Is the U.S. unique in violating his law?
Broadening his view beyond the U.S., Ferguson observes that many countries are currently violating Ferguson's law, meaning their interest expenses exceed their defense spending. The sole exception among G7 members, he notes, is Germany, which has historically imposed a strict constitutional debt brake, limiting new borrowing.
Only Germany in the G7 isn't violating it.
Currently, yes. However, even that is changing, as Germany's new government is loosening fiscal constraints to pursue significant rearmament in response to the war in Ukraine. He points out that several other countries, including Italy and Japan, are in even worse fiscal straits than the U.S., carrying much higher debt loads. Furthermore, he highlights that all G7 countries possess much smaller military capabilities than the U.S. and have very limited capacity to change that quickly. It would be a heroic achievement, he suggests, for most European countries just to increase their defense spending to 3.5% of GDP, let alone reach the 5% of GDP target that former President Trump is reportedly demanding.
So a lot of countries are fiscally constrained. What about China?
China, too, despite its robust economic growth in past decades, faces its own version of this fiscal challenge. While its central government debt might not appear too problematic on the surface, Ferguson states that the local government debt problem is terrible, with many provincial and municipal governments heavily indebted through off-balance sheet vehicles.
The hidden local debt.
This leads him to describe a strange world, where every country is weak in a similar way. The three big global players, the U.S., China, and Europe, are bogged down by excessive public debt and struggling to muster the resources for an arms race, or even to simply maintain their current military strength and influence. This collective fiscal weakness means that none of them are truly strong enough to effectively control a significant sphere of influence, or act as a stabilizing global force, which, perversely, gives economically weak but strategically aggressive countries such as Russia and Iran the opportunity to pose meaningful military threats, as their relative weakness becomes less of a disadvantage against fiscally constrained superpowers. That's a truly unsettling vision, a world where major powers are too financially strained to maintain stability, creating openings for smaller, aggressive actors. It really connects the dots between domestic fiscal policy and global geopolitics. He concludes that the world feels as volatile and unstable as it does today, largely because of these fiscal constraints on the big players, which limit their ability to act decisively and deter aggression.
Now, despite this troubling outlook, Ferguson ends his segment on a note of cautious optimism, particularly about technology. How does AI fit into this bleak picture? Could it be a game changer?
Despite this otherwise troubling outlook, Ferguson does end his segment on a distinct note of cautious, technology-driven optimism. He suggests that if AI technology proves even a quarter as good as its proponents claim, it could potentially unleash a productivity boom across economies.
AI driving productivity growth.
This, he argues, could allow countries to effectively grow their way out of their debt problems, much like the Industrial Revolution, with its transformative impact on productivity, allowed Great Britain to manage and reduce its massive debt load centuries ago. It's a powerful historical parallel.
Like growing the denominator, GDP, faster than the numerator, debt.
Precisely. Moreover, he points out that the cost of national security itself may decline dramatically thanks to technological advancements. He envisions a future where the expensive, large-scale military hardware of the late 20th century increasingly gives way to less costly military technologies, like swarms of advanced drones, autonomous systems, and highly efficient cyber capabilities.
Cheaper defense tech.
He urges us to always remember how nonlinear and surprising history is, implying that such technological discontinuities and paradigm shifts are absolutely possible. He firmly believes that if any country is in pole position to harness the benefits of these innovations, especially AI, it is the U.S., given its leading role in technological development. He has long argued that the federal government's widespread inefficiencies and excessive costs primarily reflect the failure to apply technological solutions to America's greatest problem, which is the high cost and often low quality of many public services. AI, he suggests, could solve those issues by streamlining government operations, improving service delivery, and dramatically cutting costs.
So AI could fix government inefficiency and boost growth.
That's the potential he sees. Ultimately, though, and this is Ferguson's crucial caveat, he emphasizes that the fundamental obstacles to solving America's fiscal problems are not technological, but political.
Back to the political problem again.
He finds it An especially bizarre political economy problem, that a country as economically successful and technologically advanced as the U.S. consistently produces budgets that never balance, seemingly unable to make the hard choices required.
Mm.
He stresses the urgent need for politicians to get their act together to deploy technological solutions to the provision of public goods by embracing efficiency and innovation rather than resisting it. His final warning is stark. If they fail to do so, if political will remains absent, then not even brilliant AI technology will prevent the great era of American primacy from coming to an end, with significant repercussions not only for the U.S. but also for the global order as a whole. The technology is there, he implies, but the leadership to wield it effectively for fiscal discipline is missing.
Those are powerful warnings from Dalio, Rogoff, and Ferguson, all pointing to a distinct and worrying fiscal trajectory for the U.S., heavily influenced by historical patterns and the erosion of past advantages. So what does this all mean for the near-term outlook? Is it all doom and gloom right away? And what does it mean for you as a listener, especially if you're keeping an eye on the markets? We turn now to Alec Phillips, Goldman Sachs' chief U.S. political economist, who offers a more nuanced, though still ultimately concerned, perspective on the immediate future of U.S. fiscal policy. He suggests the short-term picture might be less dramatic than some expect, but the long-term challenge remains.
Alec Phillips provides a critical assessment of the Trump administration's fiscal policies, but with a particular focus on their near-term impact. While he shares the longer-term concern about the overall U.S. fiscal trajectory, he offers a different immediate outlook. He estimates that the cumulative impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, combined with projected tariff revenues under the new administration, will result in only a slightly smaller deficit and a growth hit over the immediate future.
Okay, let's break that down. A slightly smaller deficit, despite a bill with big and beautiful in its name, sounds like a contradiction. Can you walk us through the main components of this act and why its impact isn't necessarily a massive deficit increase in the short term from Phillips's perspective?
Certainly. Phillips estimates that the Trump administration's One Big Beautiful Bill Act is a complex package with 5 main components, and understanding their individual and collective impact is key to his nuanced view. First, there's the extension and expansion of expiring individual tax cuts.
The 2017 tax cuts expiring, right?
Exactly. This involves roughly $3.3 trillion over 10 years in personal tax cuts that were set to expire at the end of 2025. Now, relative to official forecasts that assume these cuts would expire, this extension adds to the deficit. However, compared to current policy, where these cuts are already in effect, it doesn't increase the deficit from its present level in the short term.
It depends on the baseline.
Precisely. On top of that, the bill expands a few of these tax cuts, reducing taxes by around $60 billion per year, or 0.1% of GDP, over the next few years. So it's about making permanent what was temporary and then adding a little more.
Okay, component 1, individual tax cuts. What's 2?
Second, the bill incorporates specific Trump campaign tax pledges, effectively codifying them into law. This includes the elimination of taxes on tips and extra overtime pay, though with certain limits. It also allows for the deduction of auto loan interest, which is a new break for car buyers, and provides a larger standard deduction specifically for seniors, aiming to provide financial relief to an important demographic.
Okay, targeted tax breaks.
Furthermore, the deductibility of state and local taxes, known as SALT, a contentious issue for many high-tax states, would incrementally expand, providing more relief there. Combined, Phillips projects these changes are set to reduce personal taxes by approximately $75 billion per year, or 0.2% of GDP, over the coming years. These are targeted tax cuts designed to appeal to specific voter groups and address perceived inequities.
Got it. Third component.
Third, we have significant business investment incentives. The House-passed bill reinstates 3 key policies aimed at boosting business investment and economic activity. These are, first, 100% expensing for equipment investment, which allows companies to immediately deduct the full cost of new equipment rather than depreciating it over time, encouraging immediate capital expenditure.
Makes buying equipment cheaper up front.
Exactly. Second, full expensing of research and development costs, which is critical for innovation. And third, slightly more generous interest deductibility for businesses. In addition, the bill introduces a new incentive: full expensing for factories, chemical plants, and refineries, meaning businesses can immediately write off the entire cost of building new industrial facilities.
Wow, full expensing for factories, too.
These provisions are quite substantial, projected to boost the deficit by more than $100 billion in fiscal year 2026 alone. However, Phillips notes that much of this immediate boost is a timing change, meaning the longer-term annual cost will be smaller as these expenses are simply accelerated from future years into the present, providing an immediate stimulus.
Okay, fourth part, spending.
Fourth, the bill includes substantial new spending, totaling roughly $400 billion over the next decade. This significant allocation is distributed across several key areas. $184 billion earmarked for immigration enforcement, reflecting a priority on border security. $150 billion for defense, aimed at bolstering military capabilities. $12 billion for air traffic control modernization, addressing infrastructure needs. And $59 billion for farm subsidies, providing support to the agricultural sector.
So immigration, defense, ATC, farms.
These funds are slated to be spent at a pace of $60–70 billion per year, or 0.2% of GDP for the next several years, representing a direct increase in government outlays across various sectors.
And finally, number 5.
Spending cuts.
Finally, the fifth component involves spending cuts, totaling approximately $1.6 trillion over 10 years, or 0.4% of GDP. These cuts are primarily achieved by limiting eligibility for Medicaid, the federal state health care program for low-income individuals, and food stamps, and by shifting some of the costs of these critical social safety net programs to states, which could strain state budgets.
Cuts to Medicaid, food stamps.
Smaller cuts to student loan programs and federal employee benefits also contribute to these projected savings. Additionally, the bill specifically targets green spending and subsidies, proposing cuts of roughly $600 billion over 10 years, or 0.15% of GDP, reflecting a shift in spending priorities away from climate-related initiatives.
Okay, so that's the whole package. How does it net out, deficit-wise?
Phillips clarifies the overall deficit impact by explaining that, compared to official forecasts, which typically assume that expiring tax cuts actually expire, thereby reducing the deficit over time, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act would indeed boost the primary deficit by $2.4 trillion, or 0.6% of GDP, through 2034. The primary deficit, for clarity, is the government's budget deficit before accounting for interest payments on its debt.
Okay, $2.14 increase versus the official baseline.
However, when compared to current policies, meaning what's in place right now, assuming those expiring tax cuts are simply extended as a matter of course, the bill would actually reduce the primary deficit by around $1.8 trillion, or 0.5% of GDP.
So a $1.08 reduction versus current policy. That's the confusing part.
It is confusing. It all hinges on that baseline comparison. He also notes a contingency. If Congress were to extend temporary tax cuts beyond their scheduled sunset in late 2028 or early 2029, the bill would add approximately $400 billion over 10 years, or 0.1% of GDP, to the primary deficit. Phillips expects that the Senate version of the bill, if it passes, will likely make the business investment incentives permanent, which would be a positive for growth, but probably not the personal tax cuts, which have a larger deficit impact.
But how does this lead to a smaller deficit overall in the near term?
A truly crucial part of Phillips's analysis, and why he projects a slightly smaller deficit in the near term, is how tariff revenues will offset these fiscal impacts. While the legislation itself on its own would indeed worsen the deficit over the next few years, he believes that revenue generated from the administration's proposed tariffs, which could involve widespread, significant duties on imports, would likely raise even more money than this.
Ah, the tariffs. That's the missing piece.
Exactly. He specifically projects that if goods imports decline roughly proportionally to a substantial 13 percentage point rise in tariffs across the board, then tariffs alone could generate around 1.25% of GDP, or about $400 billion, in fiscal year 2026.
$400 billion from tariffs.
But he notes that the overall increase in federal revenues would be somewhat smaller than that $400 billion, as he has lowered expectations for other revenues slightly due to the growth hit that tariffs themselves often cause, by making imports more expensive and potentially slowing trade. Ultimately, compared to the start of the year, his forecast is that the combined effect of these policies, with larger-than-expected tariffs largely offsetting slightly larger tax cuts, is projected to result in a slight deficit reduction over the next few years.
Okay.
This leaves his projected marketable Treasury debt level roughly unchanged compared to earlier projections, settling at around 120% of GDP 10 years out, up from around 100% today. So for Phillips, the immediate picture isn't a dramatic fiscal cliff, but rather a plateauing at an already very high level.
So if the near-term forecast is a slight deficit reduction, even if it's from a high base, that sounds almost manageable. But Phillips's overall take is still one of deep concern. Where's the disconnect? Why is simply not worsening the deficit not good enough in his view?
That's the critical nuance, and it highlights Phillips's deeper concern. His key warning is that simply not worsening the deficit and debt trajectory over the next decade is fundamentally not good enough. This unchanged trajectory, even if it avoids immediate deterioration, still leaves the U.S. fiscal outlook in an unsustainable position over the longer term.
Unsustainable even if it stays flat at 120% debt to GDP.
Yes, because he highlights that the primary deficit, which again is the government's budget deficit before interest payments, so it reflects core spending decisions, is already roughly 5% of GDP, wider than is typical during periods of full employment.
So even in good times, we're overspending by 5% of GDP compared to normal.
That's the structural issue. And while he doesn't expect a recession in his baseline forecast for the immediate future, history shows recessions occur on average once every 10 years. Such downturns typically add a substantial cumulative primary deficit, about 5 percentage points due to cyclical effects, like lower tax revenue from slower economic activity and higher safety net spending as more people become unemployed.
Right, automatic stabilizers kick in.
And another 8 percentage points on average as a result of counter-cyclical policies, meaning government stimulus measures enacted to fight the recession. So the U.S. is starting from a deep fiscal hole, with an expectation of more holes being dug in the future.
We're not building buffers in good times.
Exactly. This trend is particularly striking, Phillips notes, in light of the significant rise in the debt level over the last 2 decades. Historically, U.S. fiscal policy has typically tightened in response to a rising public debt burden. This was achieved through a combination of tax increases and spending cuts, as policymakers recognized the need for fiscal discipline. However, more recently, the response has been dramatically in the opposite direction. Instead of tightening, fiscal policy has continued to expand, even during periods of economic strength.
Why they change?
Phillips suggests this might be partly due to multiple severe economic shocks over the past couple of decades: the global financial crisis, the pandemic, which necessitated massive government spending. But he also believes it's likely due to a fundamental shift in the political landscape around deficit reduction, where there's less political will or consensus to tackle the issue proactively.
Back to politics again. Does he see any catalyst for change?
Phillips expresses profound pessimism about political action on this front. Once the current fiscal package passes, which he expects by August, he states it's not clear what could force lawmakers to grapple with deficit reduction. He considers several potential future catalysts that might theoretically spark action. A debt limit debate in 2027 might put a spotlight on the fiscal outlook, but he notes that historically, such debates have not been a driver of major reforms. They've mostly been about avoiding default, not fundamental change.
Right, debt limit fights haven't led to big fixes.
The expiration of temporary tax cuts at the end of 2028 or 2029 could prompt a fiscal debate, but he deems it unlikely on its own to lead to net deficit reduction, as politicians are likely to extend them again. The most obvious hard catalyst on the horizon, he suggests, won't arrive until the early 2030s, when the Medicare and Social Security programs are projected to exhaust their trust funds, meaning they won't be able to pay full benefits.
The entitlement crunch in the 2030s.
Historically, this risk has led to substantial policy changes, but Phillips observes that, at the moment, neither party appears interested in reducing such spending due to the political unpopularity of cutting entitlements. Without an obvious policy event likely to force lawmakers to reevaluate fiscal policy, he grimly concludes that an adverse financial market response might ultimately be the forcing factor for more meaningful policy changes.
So only a market tantrum will force action.
In other words, only when the market explicitly punishes the U.S. for its fiscal profligacy will politicians be compelled to act, and that could be a very painful reckoning.
That's a fascinating, if concerning, view from Alec Phillips, showing how policy decisions can sometimes create paradoxical outcomes in the short term, giving a false sense of security, but leave those long-term structural challenges firmly in place, just waiting for the right catalyst. So if the experts are unified in their long-term concern, and Phillips sees an eventual market reckoning as the most likely forcing factor, what does this all mean for you as a listener, especially if you're keeping a clean eye on the markets? How are these fiscal fears translating into real financial movements? Let's turn to Kamaksha Trivedi, Goldman Sachs head of global FX, rates, and emerging market strategy, for his take on the market impacts.
Kamaksha Trivedi confirms that U.S. fiscal concerns are indeed manifesting very clearly and powerfully in global financial markets. He points to several key observable indicators. First, there's been a sharp and significant rise in long-term borrowing costs for the U.S. government.
Higher bond yields.
Specifically, the yields on 10-year and 30-year U.S. Treasury maturities, which are the benchmark rates for long-term borrowing for both the government and, by extension, corporations and consumers, rose a significant 25 to 30 basis points in May alone.
25, 30 BPs in 1 month is quite a jump.
It is. To put that in perspective, a basis point is 1/100th of a percentage point, so 25, 30 basis points means a 0.25% to 0.30% increase in yield in a single month for long-term government bonds. That's a considerable jump for assets that are supposed to be among the safest in the world, directly signaling a rising risk premium for holding U.S. debt.
Okay, higher yields. What else?
Second, the dollar, rather than strengthening on higher yields as it often does, has continued to depreciate against other major currencies. And third, while equity markets may have recovered from some earlier sell-offs, the underlying pressure on U.S. bonds and the dollar has continued unabated, precisely due to these mounting and persistent fiscal concerns.
Higher yields and a weaker dollar. That's unusual.
Very unusual. Investors are no longer taking U.S. fiscal health for granted. They are now scrutinizing every bond auction and every piece of fiscal news as a barometer of future risk.
That's a really interesting point about the dollar depreciating despite higher yields. It flies in the face of conventional wisdom. Can you explain the paradox here? Why are markets so focused on U.S. fiscal issues now, even if the new bill isn't immediately disastrous, according to Phillips?
It is indeed a curious paradox, and Trivedi explains it quite well. He suggests that the de-escalation of trade policy, particularly after the peak Liberation Day tariffs, referring to a period where trade tensions seem to be easing, actually assuaged some initial market concerns about a potential recession.
Less worry about a trade war recession.
Exactly. And that, ironically, contributed to this heightened fiscal focus. In simpler terms, the more markets shifted away from worries about an immediate recession and the likelihood of the Federal Reserve easing monetary policy, which would typically involve cutting interest rates to stimulate the economy, the more right-tail risks associated with higher rates from the deficit have come into focus.
Right-tail risks, meaning the risk of higher rates and inflation.
Precisely. Right-tail risks, in financial terms, mean the risk of outcomes that are at the extreme positive end of expectations in this case. Unexpectedly high interest rates or inflation due to unchecked government spending, rather than the expected low rates of a recession. So, as growth concerns lessened, the risk of higher inflation and interest rates due to unchecked government spending became a more prominent and immediate worry for investors. On the margin, the prospect of lower tariff revenues, which were seen as a potential offset to deficits, also technically worsens the fiscal outlook if they don't materialize as strongly. Furthermore, the timing is crucial. The fiscal bill is taking center stage precisely at the same time as an increasingly challenging growth-inflation mix in the economy, what some might call a stagflationary environment, where growth is sluggish but inflation is stubbornly high. This naturally amplifies market sensitivity to fiscal vulnerabilities as there's less room for policy maneuver.
So less recession fear meant more focus on the debt risk. Makes sense. How is this affecting other markets globally?
The ripples of concern over fiscal pressures are extending beyond the U.S., though the U.S. still sees the largest and most direct market moves. In Japan, for instance, long-end yields saw a significant surge last month, with 30-year Japanese government bond, or GGB, yields briefly surpassing 30-year German Bund yields.
Japanese yields higher than German. That's rare.
Very rare. While local market technicals, such as reduced demand for long-dated duration bonds and the Bank of Japan's quantitative tightening, which means they're reducing their bond purchases, played a role, Trivedi notes that underlying fiscal deficits and persistently resilient inflation in Japan also contributed to this movement. It suggests that even in a country known for low rates, underlying fiscal concerns are starting to surface in bond markets. Interestingly, unlike in the U.S., this sell-off in Japanese bonds did not lead to broader weakness in other Japanese assets like equities or the currency, suggesting a more localized impact so far. In the UK and the euro area, long-end yields also rose, but to a lesser extent and with less volatility than in the U.S., indicating a degree of contagion but not the same intensity of concern.
What about emerging markets? Are they getting hit hard?
Emerging markets, or EMs, have, somewhat surprisingly, seen fiscal pressures contained so far. This is largely attributed to their generally lower overall debt levels compared to developed markets. Their improved external fundamentals, meaning their current accounts and foreign exchange reserves, are in better shape and relative currency strength.
So EMs are more resilient this time.
For now, it seems so. Consequently, EM fiscal pressures have been less in focus globally, and adverse market spillovers from rising U.S. rates have been more limited than what might typically be expected. Historically, rising U.S. rates would often trigger capital flight from EMs, However, Trivedi cautions that while EM fiscal consolidation has broadly continued post-pandemic, progress has stalled in some regions. He specifically cites Colombia, parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and Brazil as areas where long-end yields have indeed exhibited more pressure, in sympathy with the broader pressures seen in core developed market fixed income. This indicates that while the overall EM picture is more resilient, pockets of vulnerability remain where fiscal discipline has lagged.
That's a critical point, how resilient EMs have been for the most part. But it brings up a chilling comparison. Trivedi directly addresses whether the U.S. could experience a crisis similar to the 2022 gilt crisis in the UK, which was triggered by Liz Truss's mini-budget and led to dramatic market chaos. Does he see parallels, or are there fundamental differences that would protect the U.S.?
Trivedi does directly address the question of whether the U.S. could experience a crisis similar to the dramatic 2022 gilt crisis in the UK, which caused widespread market turmoil and forced a policy reversal. He identifies several clear parallels between that episode and the current U.S. situation.
Okay, what are the parallels?
These include a stagflationary macro backdrop where inflation is high and growth is sluggish, the sidelining of independent agencies such as the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK, and in the U.S. context, the CBO, whose warnings might be downplayed, and the extension of large unfunded tax cuts at a time of low unemployment and already strong demand, which can exacerbate inflation. So on the surface, there are indeed similar ingredients.
So the setup looks similar in some ways. What's different?
However, he highlights crucial distinctions that might protect the U.S. from such an acute, immediate blow-up. The severe, nonlinear moves in UK bond markets also owed significantly to leverage embedded in financial structures used by UK pension funds.
The LDI crisis.
Exactly. This meant that small market moves were amplified into a much larger crisis due to forced selling by these highly leveraged institutions. Trivedi notes that such specific dynamics are currently absent in U.S. markets, meaning there isn't an obvious, widespread structural vulnerability in the financial plumbing that would immediately amplify a bond sell-off into a systemic crisis.
But he adds a caveat.
Although he prudently adds that these leverage structures are often only apparent in retrospect, meaning they might exist but are hidden until a stress test reveals them.
Right. Anything else protecting the U.S.?
Another important distinction he points out is the U.S. Senate, which he sees as acting as a safeguard against unchecked fiscal plans passed by the House, assuming it performs its intended role as a check on the lower chamber. Ultimately, he believes the reaction of the bond market itself could ultimately act as the most important safeguard.
The bond vigilantes again.
He argues that a sharp and sustained increase in already higher U.S. long-term yields, which would make the fiscal arithmetic even more forbidding for the government by massively increasing interest payments, is likely to do more to force Washington's focus on fiscal matters than any other institutional mechanism. The market, in essence, becomes the ultimate disciplinarian.
So maybe no gilt crisis, but are there still lasting impacts?
Even if a full-blown gilt-style crisis is averted through these safeguards, Trivedi affirms that lasting market impacts are likely. He points to the recent fiscal concerns contributing to a breakdown in traditional asset correlations, a phenomenon that he expects to be longer-lasting, similar to what has been observed in the UK since its gilt crisis.
Breakdown and correlations. What does that mean for investors?
Traditionally, safe haven assets like U.S. Treasuries are expected to rally when negative growth shocks occur, providing a hedge or protection to risky investments like stocks. Even in times of high inflation and tighter monetary policy, the dollar has typically helped hedge equity exposures by strengthening. However, the recent episodes of simultaneously higher yields, dollar weakness, and occasionally lower equity prices indicate this traditional hedging relationship is weakening.
So bonds and the dollar aren't acting like the safe havens they used to?
They seem to be less reliable in that role right now. This breakdown could have serious implications for portfolio allocation. It will likely lead to a longer-lasting reassessment of safe portfolios and a right-sizing of U.S. allocations, even if near-term fiscal concerns eventually fade. This suggests investors will increasingly diversify away from a heavy reliance on U.S. assets, moving capital to other regions or asset classes, because U.S. assets are no longer providing the same reliable diversification benefits.
Okay, so investors might reduce U.S. exposure. What's his final word on yields and the dollar?
Trivedi concludes with his expectations for the likely direction of U.S. bond yields and the dollar in this new fiscal reality. For U.S. bond yields, he sees limited scope for significant further relief at the long end of the curve, end quote. Given the heightened fiscal concerns, the immense supply of new U.S. debt, and their dampening effect on demand for U.S. assets from global investors, he expects factors supporting sticky, higher, longer-term U.S. yields to remain firmly in place.
So yields stay higher for longer.
That's the expectation. He states unequivocally that long U.S. rates will remain in a higher neighborhood than the post-GFC era until the underlying fiscal deficit is restrained. Furthermore, he warns that these higher yields will also inherently make any future fiscal expansion more costly for the government. If they borrow more, they'll pay even higher interest rates on that new debt.
And the dollar, more weakness.
Regarding the dollar, Trivedi expects more dollar weakness this time, which is a notable departure from typical historical patterns where greater U.S. net issuance of debt usually results in a dollar positive effect as investors pour money into the U.S. to buy those bonds.
Why weaker this time?
He provides several compelling reasons for this divergence. First, foreign investors are starting from already high allocations to U.S. assets, suggesting less available capital for further increases in their holdings. Second, the breakdown in rate currency correlations, which we just discussed, suggests lower demand for U.S. assets as a result of these fiscal risks, meaning higher yields aren't attracting foreign capital as they once did.
Okay.
And third, he sees less exceptional U.S. growth and capital return prospects compared to other economies. In essence, he concludes that the erosion of U.S. exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. economy and markets are fundamentally superior and uniquely attractive, is proving to be literally costly for the dollar, as investors no longer see the same compelling reasons to flock to U.S. assets.
That's a truly comprehensive look at the market's pulse in response to these fiscal jitters, from long-term bond yields to the dollar's global standing. It's clear the U.S. isn't operating in a vacuum here. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's evident that the U.S. isn't the only major economy grappling with significant fiscal questions. So let's pivot our focus now to other major global economies, starting with Europe, where the fiscal spotlight seems to be moving in some rather surprising and unexpected ways.
Indeed, new insights from Goldman Sachs' senior European economists, Filippo Taddei, James Moberly, and Alexandra Stott, reveal a notable and, as you say, surprising shifting fiscal focus within Europe. Historically, concerns about sovereign debt in Europe tended to concentrate heavily on the traditionally troubled periphery, primarily Italy and Spain, which were at the heart of the Eurozone debt crisis a decade ago.
Right. Italy and Spain were the main worries.
These were the countries whose bond yields soared, raising fears about the integrity of the euro. However, there's been a significant and distinct shift in market attention, with concerns now increasing sharply regarding the fiscal outlook in major core economies like France and the UK.
The focus is shifting to France and the UK.
Exactly. This shift is clearly evident in how financial markets are behaving. Italian and Spanish sovereign spreads, which are the difference in yields compared to benchmark German bonds, acting as a proxy for perceived risk, have continued to tighten, recently reaching their lowest levels in about 15 years. This suggests reduced perceived risk and greater market confidence in these countries' fiscal health.
So Italy and Spain look better to markets now.
Relatively speaking, yes. In stark contrast, UK gilts, which are UK government bonds, are still contending with lasting impacts from the traumatic 2022 mini-budget crisis and subsequent fiscal slippage in 2024, leading to persistent higher yields. Simultaneously, France's snap general election earlier this year led to a sizable and immediate widening in OAT bond spreads, indicating increased market concern about French debt and political stability. These economists expect this shift in fiscal focus away from the periphery and towards France and the UK to persist for fundamental reasons.
That's a fascinating reorientation of market concern within Europe. What are the fundamental drivers behind this persistent shift? Why are France and the UK increasingly under the fiscal microscope, while the periphery seems to be improving?
This persistence is driven by three key diverging factors that are influencing fiscal health across Europe. First, we have diverging deficit trajectories. Peripheral countries like Italy and Spain are actually demonstrating a faster and more consistent reduction in their fiscal deficits.
Italy and Spain are cutting deficits faster.
They are benefiting significantly from the European Recovery Fund, a massive EU initiative launched post-pandemic, which provides around 1.52% of their GDP in fiscal support through grants and subsidized loans, thereby boosting their budgets and allowing them to invest without solely relying on national debt.
Ah, the EU Recovery Fund helps them.
Furthermore, future EU debt, likely funded through the upcoming European Defense Facility, or EDF, is expected to support additional defense spending in Italy and Spain. While this spending will still contribute to their deficits, the EDF mechanism is designed to decrease their funding costs and extend the average maturity of their public debt, making it more manageable and less immediately burdensome. By contrast, France and the UK continue to face substantial fiscal challenges. In France, lowering the fiscal deficit necessitates a fundamental and politically difficult shift in the composition of fiscal consolidation, moving away from relying on higher taxes towards implementing more difficult and often unpopular spending cuts.
France needs spending cuts, which are hard politically.
Very hard. In the UK, further tax changes are likely to be required in the autumn budget simply to keep the government's consolidation plans on track, especially with increasing pressure to raise defense spending above 2.5% of GDP, which will add significant costs.
Okay, so diverging deficit paths is factor one. What's two?
The second diverging factor is their diverging macroeconomic backdrops. Europe as a whole has seen its sovereign real rate, the difference between sovereign bond yields and nominal economic growth, a key determinant of debt sustainability, deteriorate. This is largely due to rising trade tensions leading to slower growth across the continent, downward pressure on inflation in some sectors, and upward pressure on long-end yields globally.
So the overall Eurozone picture is tougher.
However, the macroeconomic environment in the periphery, specifically Italy and Spain, is actually less challenging than in the run-up to the COVID-19 pandemic. Italian and Spanish sovereign real rates, for instance, are still approximately 120 basis points lower, respectively, than their pre-pandemic averages, giving them more breathing room for their debt to be serviced.
So the periphery has a slightly better macro setup than before.
Relative to their own pre-pandemic levels, yes. In stark contrast, the increase in long-end yields in France and the UK has pushed their interest rate growth differentials above their pre-pandemic levels. This means that interest rates are now higher relative to their economic growth, significantly complicating their fiscal outlook and making it much harder for them to grow their way out of their debt burdens through organic economic expansion alone.
So France and the UK face a tougher rate growth dynamic. Got it. And the third factor?
The third and final factor driving this divergence is diverging political constraints. Historically, wider sovereign spreads have been tightly linked to a sitting government's inability to effectively contain fiscal deficits, often due to political instability or a lack of consensus. At present, this risk appears relatively contained in Italy and Spain.
Italy and Spain are politically stable enough.
Relatively, yes. In Italy, the government enjoys a large parliamentary majority, providing a stable political foundation, and remains committed to gradual but steady fiscal consolidation. They also benefit from high public consensus in opinion polls, which lends political capital to their efforts. In Spain, while the minority government has faced challenges in approving a budget, this difficulty has paradoxically helped to keep the Spanish fiscal deficit in check by preventing additional spending slippage as new spending initiatives struggle to pass.
Interesting. A weak government helping the deficit there.
They've also been able to make strategic decisions on industrial support that might require future funding without destabilizing the current fiscal situation. As such, there are no immediate political catalysts that seriously threaten stability or deficit reduction efforts in the periphery.
Okay, so politics look calmer in the periphery. What about France and the UK?
In contrast, political uncertainty has increased sharply in France. The 2024 snap elections resulted in a hung parliament, meaning no single party or clear majority exists to support a stable government, making legislative action incredibly difficult.
The hung parliament in France, right?
The fragile coalition that supported the passage of a 2025 budget earlier this year, including the Socialist Party, President Macron's allies, and the center-right, will be severely tested as Prime Minister Bayrou attempts to reduce the deficit further with an ambitious 2026 budget. This situation raises the very real risk of a potential government collapse, with fresh snap elections becoming possible starting in July. The significant political constraints to deficit reduction, coupled with the associated uncertainty, are primary reasons for market participants to remain acutely focused on the French fiscal outlook.
So high political risk in France and the UK.
The UK also faces considerable political pressure. The government is likely to face increasing demands to raise defense spending above 2.5% of GDP before the next election, a costly commitment in a tight fiscal environment. While some fiscal measures, like partially reversing cuts to winter fuel payments and reportedly considering scrapping the two-child benefit cap, would use up already limited fiscal space, the government has very little room to maneuver against its deficit target. Even a modest downgrade to the Office for Budget Responsibilities, or OBR's, comparatively optimistic growth assumptions could entirely wipe out that fiscal headroom, forcing even more difficult choices. The autumn budget, expected between October and November, will be a critical test for the Chancellor.
Lots of pressure on the UK budget, too.
The Prime Minister's recent comments have emphasized fiscal prudence, suggesting the government will most likely respond to fiscal pressures through tax hikes rather than changes to fiscal rules, which could be politically unpopular. An extension of the freeze on personal tax thresholds seems the most likely option, but further adjustments could be necessary if defense spending continues to rise above 2.5% of GDP in the current parliament. While tax increases should help reduce the deficit over time, the current fiscal challenges remain significant. These fundamental drivers, the diverging deficit trajectories, macroeconomic backdrops, and political constraints, will likely keep the fiscal focus squarely on France and the UK. Meanwhile, euro area fiscal policy may become more growth supportive via defense and investment, while the UK is expected to continue its fiscal consolidation, exerting a moderate drag on growth.
That's a profound and detailed shift within Europe, moving the fiscal spotlight from where we've traditionally expected it to be. Now, let's turn our attention to Asia's big debt booms, Japan and China. Both of these economic giants carry immense debt loads. Given their sheer size and economic weight, it's crucial to understand their fiscal situations. Are they facing the same kind of ticking time bomb as the U.S., or is there a different dynamic at play?
When it comes to Japan and China, Andrew Tilton, Goldman Sachs' chief Asia-Pacific economist, and Kevin Daly, Goldman Sachs' co-head of CME economics, offer compelling reasons for less concern about their fiscal situations despite their very high debt levels.
Less concern, even with Japan's 250% debt to GDP.
It seems counterintuitive, yes. But the key factor underpinning this relative reassurance, and a crucial distinction from the U.S., is their high domestic savings. Both countries have maintained consistently high domestic savings rates for decades, meaning a large portion of their national income is saved rather than consumed. This fundamental characteristic has enabled them to run persistent current account surpluses, meaning they export more goods and services than they import, and to accumulate large positive net international investment positions, or NIPs.
They save a lot, run surpluses, and own more assets abroad than foreigners own in their country.
Exactly. A positive NIP indicates that a country's external assets, what its residents and government own abroad, like foreign investments and reserves, exceed its external liabilities, what foreigners own in the country. This makes them net creditors to the world, providing a significant buffer.
So if they're saving so much, does that mean their debt is mostly held internally? And how does that make a difference?
Exactly. This strong domestic savings base allows the vast majority of their government debt to be held within the domestic economy. This means domestic entities such as Japanese banks, pension funds, insurance companies, or individual savers in China are the primary purchasers of their government bonds. When debt is primarily held by internal actors, the risks are typically much more limited compared to situations where a country relies heavily on foreign creditors.
Why is internally held debt safer?
Think about it. When foreign creditors hold a large portion of a country's debt, they can demand higher interest rates, or in times of stress or loss of confidence, quickly pull out their capital, leading to currency depreciation, a spike in domestic interest rates, and potential financial crises. But with domestic debt holdings, the capital stays within the system, and the government is largely beholden to its own citizens and institutions, not external forces. Kevin Daly reinforces this perspective with a broader, historically informed argument. He states that external imbalances are typically a better predictor of sovereign and financial crises than government imbalances.
External imbalances matter more than government deficits.
That's his core point, based on historical data. This means that looking at a country's current account deficits, how much it borrows from abroad, and its net foreign asset positions, whether it's a net borrower or lender to the world, are more reliable indicators of vulnerability than simply looking at government budget deficits and debt levels in isolation. This principle offers significant reassurance for most EM economies, and specifically underpins the more sanguine view on Japan and China, given their strong external positions. Their domestic savings provide a solid foundation that external debt, for example, does not.
That's a truly fascinating distinction, that internal versus external debt holding is so critical in assessing risk. It really challenges the simplistic view that high debt equals crisis. Finally, let's explore emerging markets, which have often been at the center of debt crisis discussions throughout history. Is this time different for them as well? Are they still as vulnerable as they once were?
For emerging markets, or EMs, the consensus from experts like Alberto Ramos, head of LATAM Economics Research, and Kevin Daly, is that while a full-blown, widespread EM debt crisis doesn't appear imminent, high public debt still comes with several significant macro costs. which will likely only rise from here.
So no big crisis looming, but high debt still hurts them.
Precisely. It's not a crisis, but it's not a free pass either. The primary reasons a widespread crisis isn't seen as imminent for most EMs are their relatively strong external balances, meaning they don't have large, unsustainable current account deficits or deeply negative net international investment positions, and their increasing reliance on local market funding.
They're borrowing more in their own currencies now.
Yes, much more than in the past. This means they are issuing more debt in their own currencies to domestic investors, rather than borrowing heavily in foreign currencies from international creditors. This significantly reduces their vulnerability to sudden stop capital account funding crises, where foreign capital abruptly withdraws, causing a currency collapse and potential default. They've learned painful lessons from past crises.
That increased reliance on local market funding certainly sounds like a protective shield. But Alberto Ramos also talks about EMs being more debt intolerant. What does he mean by that, and what are the specific costs of this high debt, even if it's not leading to an immediate crisis?
That's a crucial point. Alberto Ramos emphasizes that EMs are indeed more debt intolerant than DM, or developed markets. Unlike developed markets, EMs generally don't have a successful track record of seamlessly working out or growing out of large debt burdens without experiencing significant economic or financial distress.
They struggle more with high debt levels.
Historically, yes. In many historical cases, it didn't take a very large debt burden to rock the boat and trigger a crisis. In fact, many EM sovereign debt crises have occurred against a backdrop of surprisingly low to moderate levels of public indebtedness, sometimes as low as 40–50% of GDP, far below what would trigger concern in the developed nation.
Crises at 40–50% debt to GDP.
Wow. This has led some observers to characterize emerging markets as debt intolerant, meaning they have a lower inherent capacity to carry heavy debt loads. This intolerance is particularly prominent when governments cannot rely on deep, liquid local financial markets to satisfy a significant portion of their funding needs, forcing them to borrow in foreign currencies. This suggests that something distinctive about the macro environment, policy credibility, and institutional setup in many EM economies renders them less resilient and capable of carrying heavy debt loads than their developed market counterparts. To put this in perspective, the IMF projects that EM public debt will rise significantly from 55% of GDP in 2018 to 74% in 2025, and an alarming 84% by 2030. These figures are well above the historical 60–70% of GDP debt range that has typically indicated a high risk of distress for EM economies, meaning they are entering a very risky zone.
So even if no immediate crisis, what are the costs Ramos identifies?
Ramos identifies 5 significant macro costs associated with these high debt levels in EMs, even if they don't immediately trigger a full-blown crisis. First, it leads to reduced policy room for counter-cyclical fiscal policies.
Less ability to fight recessions.
Exactly. This means that when an economic downturn hits or an external shock occurs, the government has less ability to stimulate the economy through increased spending or tax cuts because its budget is already strained by debt service. Second, high debt tends to reduce fiscal multipliers, meaning that any government spending has a diminished impact on economic growth. At very high debt levels, these multipliers can even turn negative, meaning additional government spending actually harms growth by crowding out private investment.
Government spending becomes less effective or even harmful.
Third, high public debt is often consistently associated with higher macro volatility in terms of economic growth, interest rates, and inflation, creating a less predictable and more risky economic environment for businesses and citizens. Fourth, it correlates with lower medium-term per capita real GDP growth and higher inflation, meaning that high debt can lead to a gradual but persistent erosion of living standards over time for the average citizen.
So, slower growth, higher inflation, more volatility.
And fifth, fiscal fragilities and high debt burdens can significantly reduce a central bank's ability to calibrate monetary policy independently, potentially leading to a fiscal dominance trap.
Fiscal dominance, where the debt dictates monetary policy.
Precisely. In this trap, monetary policy decisions like setting interest rates or controlling money supply are no longer made independently to control inflation or support growth, but are instead dictated by the government's desperate need to finance its debt, often through the central bank effectively printing money. This fundamentally undermines the central bank's inflation-fighting credibility.
So, lots of downsides, even without a full crisis. Does Dalio agree?
Kevin Dalio reiterates his core argument, offering further reassurance for most EMs. Historical evidence strongly suggests that external imbalances, specifically current account deficits and net foreign asset positions, are a more reliable indicator of sovereign and financial crises than government budget deficits and debt.
Back to the external balances point.
This is the key reason he feels less worried about EMs more broadly than in past decades, given that their external imbalances are currently smaller and more manageable than those of many developed market economies, including the U.S. This means that even if their government debt levels are high domestically, their economies are not overly reliant on foreign capital inflows that could suddenly reverse and trigger a classic balance of payments crisis.
But are there any EMs he's still worried about?
However, despite this general reassurance, Daley highlights specific EM countries that still warrant concern due to their relatively limited external imbalances or other vulnerabilities. He names Romania, and to a lesser extent Brazil and Colombia, as nations where debt vulnerabilities are still quite elevated and warrant close monitoring by investors. He acknowledges that while the overall picture for EMs might be less immediately alarming than for the U.S. or parts of Europe, the sheer increase in EM government deficits and debt, even if domestically held, is still significant and requires careful monitoring. This means that while a widespread crisis isn't on the horizon, these economies are operating with thinner margins and less flexibility, making them vulnerable to unexpected shocks or sustained period of high global interest rates that could still trigger localized distress.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive into the state of global fiscal health, traversing centuries of history, cutting-edge economic analysis, and current market dynamics. So, what does this all mean for you? For your understanding of the global economy and perhaps even your own financial outlook, what are the key takeaways from this incredibly rich stack of sources? First, the strong consensus among these top experts is that U.S. fiscal concerns are indeed different this time. This isn't just another cyclical blip or a temporary budget spat. It's driven by a confluence of powerful structural factors: persistently high real interest rates that are here to stay, soaring debt levels that are at historical highs outside of severe crisis periods, and deeply worrying historical patterns where the cost of servicing U.S. debt now actually exceeds its defense spending.
That Ferguson's Law point, yeah.
This last point, as Sir Niall Ferguson showed us, is a critical turning point that historically has often signaled a decline in great power status, fundamentally limiting a nation's capacity to project power and deter threats. Second, we've dissected the complex interplay of current policies, like the Trump administration's One Big Beautiful Bill Act and potential tariff revenues. While Alec Phillips' analysis suggests these might not lead to an immediate, dramatic worsening of the deficit in the very near term, they certainly leave the U.S. firmly on an unsustainable long-term trajectory.
Not getting worse isn't good enough, as he said.
Exactly. And critically, there's a distinct lack of political will to address this, and no obvious policy catalyst on the horizon that appears strong enough to force action, suggesting that difficult decisions are being perpetually kicked down the road. Third, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which has long buffered the U.S. from the full consequences of its fiscal choices, is clearly eroding. Kenneth Rogoff detailed how factors like foreign demand saturation, U.S. sanctions, and the rise of other currencies are chipping away at its dominance. This, combined with the forces driving up global real interest rates, points to a likely persistence of higher long-end rates for U.S. bonds and continued dollar weakness, a break from traditional market patterns. This has profound implications for global financial markets and for how investors allocate capital, making traditional U.S.-centric portfolios potentially less diversified and resilient.
Portfolios might need rethinking.
And fourth, we've seen surprising shifts in fiscal concerns globally. Europe's fiscal spotlight has notably moved from the traditionally troubled periphery, like Italy and Spain, to major economies like France and the UK. This is driven by diverging deficit trajectories, macroeconomic backdrops, and political constraints unique to each region. Meanwhile, for Asian giants Japan and China, their high domestic savings offer a nuanced, more reassuring view despite their eye-watering debt loads, as that debt is largely held internally, insulating them from external shocks.
The internal versus external debt matters hugely there.
And finally, for emerging markets, while a full-blown debt crisis isn't imminent due to stronger external balances and local funding, the rising public debt still comes with several significant and growing macro costs, limiting their policy flexibility and increasing volatility, making them more debt intolerant than their developed counterparts.
To reinforce the core message from all these experts, while a debt crisis for the U.S. or even many other economies is not seen as absolutely inevitable in the very short term, avoiding one unequivocally demands significant fiscal discipline. The major challenge, as highlighted so powerfully by Rogoff and Ferguson, remains the profound lack of motivation and political will among both voters and politicians to make the necessary and often unpopular changes required to rein in deficits and stabilize debt.
The political hurdle seems enormous.
It does. This dynamic, sadly, leads to a potential scenario where only an adverse financial market response, perhaps a sharp and sustained surge in interest rates, further currency depreciation, or even an actual undeniable crisis, will ultimately be the forcing factor that compels policymakers to act. The human tendency to wait until the 11th hour, or even beyond, before confronting uncomfortable truths and making difficult choices truly underlies this precarious global fiscal situation. It's a test of political courage and foresight.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over, something to consider long after this deep dive concludes. If, as Sir Niall Ferguson so eloquently suggests, the ultimate obstacles to solving America's profound fiscal problems are not technological but political, especially given AI's immense, still unfolding potential to solve inefficiencies across almost every sector of government and the economy, what fundamental shift in political will or voter perspective do you believe would be strong enough to truly force policymakers to grapple with this existential issue before a crisis hits? What would that look like in practice? Would it take a massive educational campaign, a new generation of leaders, or perhaps a direct, undeniable impact on individual pocketbooks? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of global fiscal health. We hope this conversation has provided you with clarity, context, and perhaps a new lens through which to view the challenges and opportunities ahead. We encourage you to continue your own explorations into these crucial topics, because being informed is the first step toward understanding and navigating the complex world we live in. Until next time.